My wife mocked my fragile male ego until I exposed her manipulation, turned her psychology game around, and watched her confidence collapse in public. Maybe I'd disagree with her choice of restaurant or suggest a different route to avoid traffic, and she'd roll her eyes and say, "Oh, there's that fragile male ego again." At first, I actually laughed. I thought it was just her being playful, maybe picking up some trendy phrase from her girlfriends or social media, but then it became her default response to everything. I'd point out that she left the kitchen a mess after cooking, fragile male ego. I'd suggest we stick to our budget instead of buying another decorative pillow, fragile male ego. I'd ask her to turn down the TV because I had an early meeting the next day. You guessed it, fragile male ego. The real kicker was when she started using it in front of other people. We'd be at dinner with friends and I'd make some completely reasonable comment about literally anything, and she'd look at everyone else with this knowing smirk and say, "Sorry guys, you know how men get with their fragile egos." Everyone would chuckle uncomfortably, and I'd sit there wondering when exactly I became the punchline of my own marriage. The pattern was always the same. Anytime I had an opinion, anytime I stood my ground on something, anytime I displayed what normal people would call backbone, she'd whip out that phrase like it was some kind of psychological checkmate. It was designed to make me second-guess myself, to make me think that having standards or preferences somehow made me weak or insecure. What really got to me wasn't just the phrase itself, it was how calculated it was. She'd use it strategically, always in moments when I couldn't really defend myself without looking exactly like what she was accusing me of being. It was brilliant manipulation. I'll give her that. If I got upset about it, well, that just proved her point about my fragile ego. If I stayed quiet, she'd take that as permission to keep doing it. The breaking point came during a family barbecue at her parents' house. I was manning the grill, which I'd done dozens of times before, when her dad came over and started giving me advice about the meat temperature. I politely explained that I had it under control and knew what I was doing. Nothing disrespectful, just a simple statement that I didn't need help. That's when she swooped in from across the yard like some kind of ego deflation superhero. "There he goes again with that fragile male ego," she announced, loud enough for half the party to hear. "Can't even take a little help without getting all defensive." Her mom laughed. Her sister nodded knowingly, and even her dad looked at me like I was some kind of insecure child. I stood there at that grill, spatula in hand, watching my own in-laws look at me like I was the problem. That's when something clicked. This wasn't about my ego being fragile at all. This was about her needing to tear me down to build herself up. This was about control, pure and simple. I finished grilling in silence, but my mind was racing. I started thinking about all the times she'd used that phrase, all the situations where she'd deployed it like a weapon, and I realized something important. Someone who constantly needs to attack other people's confidence usually doesn't have much of their own. That night, driving home, she was still riding high on her little performance. "You were so quiet after dinner," she said with this satisfied tone. "I hope you're not sulking about earlier. You know, I was just having fun." I looked at her sitting there, so pleased with herself, so confident that she'd put me in my place once again. "Yeah," I said calmly. "I was just thinking about how interesting it is that someone would need to constantly tear down their husband to feel good about themselves." The car got very quiet after that, but I wasn't done thinking. Not by a long shot, because if she wanted to play psychological games, she was about to learn that she'd picked the wrong opponent. And her precious little phrase, it was about to become her biggest regret. After that barbecue, I started paying closer attention to her patterns. It was like watching a magician. Once you know the trick, you can't unsee how the illusion works. And her favorite trick was public humiliation disguised as playful teasing. The next incident happened at her company's holiday party. I was making conversation with one of her colleagues about the renovations we'd been doing on the house. Nothing fancy, just updating some fixtures and repainting a few rooms. Her colleague mentioned how nice it must be to have a handy husband, and I was explaining how I'd learned to do most of the work myself to save money. That's when she materialized beside us with 2 drinks and that familiar predatory smile. "Oh, he's very particular about his projects," she said, handing me a beer. "Can't stand when I suggest anything different. You know how it is with men and their fragile egos. They have to be the expert at everything." Her colleague laughed awkwardly and quickly found an excuse to walk away. I stood there holding my beer, watching my wife's satisfied expression as she destroyed my credibility with someone I'd never even met before. The worst part was how she delivered it with this tone that suggested she was sharing some universal truth about men, instead of just being cruel to her husband. But she wasn't done. Later that same evening, we were talking to another couple about vacation plans. I mentioned that I'd been researching some hiking trails for a trip we'd been planning. Simple conversation starter, right? Wrong. He's been obsessing over those trails for weeks. She jumped in with an exaggerated eye roll, reading every single review, checking elevation maps, weather patterns. I swear, suggest one alternative, and you'd think I was attacking his manhood. Fragile male ego strikes again. The other couple exchanged glances, and I could see them mentally filing me away in the difficult husband category. What made it worse was that I actually had been thorough in my research because I wanted our vacation to be perfect. I wanted us to have a great time. But in her version, my effort to plan something special became evidence of my psychological weakness. The drive home was tense. I waited until we were in the garage before I spoke. You know, I'm starting to think you don't actually like me very much. What's that supposed to mean? She asked, but I could hear the defensiveness creeping into her voice. It means that normal wives don't spend entire evenings making their husbands look like idiots in front of strangers. Oh, come on, she scoffed. I was just having a little fun. You're being way too sensitive. Sensitive? Right. Let me guess. That's just my fragile male ego talking. She paused at that, probably realizing she'd been caught in her own pattern. You are being pretty defensive right now. No, I'm being observant. There's a difference. That seemed to throw her off. She was used to me either getting angry, which proved her point, or staying quiet, which let her win. But calm observation? That was new territory. Over the next few weeks, I watched her deploy the same strategy in different settings. At her sister's birthday dinner, when I politely declined a second helping of dessert because I was full, she announced to the table that I was probably worried about my beach body and made a joke about fragile male egos and their relationship with food. Everyone laughed, but I noticed her sister's husband shift uncomfortably in his seat. At a neighborhood gathering, when I suggested we head home at a reasonable hour because I had an early morning, she told everyone I was cranky when I don't get my beauty sleep and made another crack about men being so delicate. Again, uncomfortable laughter all around. The pattern was becoming crystal clear. She wasn't just using this phrase randomly. She was using it strategically to undermine me whenever I showed any kind of preference, boundary, or decision-making. It was psychological warfare disguised as humor. But here's what she didn't realize. I was learning her playbook. Every time she used that phrase, every time she tried to make me look weak or unreasonable, I was cataloging it. I was studying her methods, her timing, her motivations, and I was starting to see something she probably didn't want me to see. Someone who needs to constantly prove how strong and independent they are by tearing down others usually isn't as strong or independent as they pretend to be. Someone who has to win every interaction, who can't let their partner have a moment of respect or authority, is operating from a place of deep insecurity. The irony was almost beautiful. She was so busy attacking my supposed fragile ego that she was revealing just how fragile her own actually was. And once I saw that, once I understood what was really happening, I knew exactly how to handle it. The next time she tried to humiliate me in public, she was going to get a very different response than she was expecting. Because I'd learned something important. The best way to deal with someone who attacks your confidence is to stay completely confident while exposing theirs. The funny thing about studying someone's behavior is that you start noticing things you never saw before. Like how my wife would check her phone obsessively when we were out together, always making sure she looked good in every reflection we passed, and how she needed constant validation from everyone around her. I started an experiment. Instead of reacting to her attacks, I began watching her reactions to everything else. What I discovered was fascinating. This woman who constantly mocked my supposed insecurities was absolutely drowning in her own. Take her relationship with social media. She'd spend hours crafting the perfect post about our dinner, our weekend, our life together. But if a photo didn't get enough likes within the first hour, she'd delete it and try again with a different caption. She'd refresh the comments constantly, and I'd watch her face fall if someone she considered important didn't engage with her content. Then there were her friends. She'd hang on every word they said, especially the ones she considered more successful or attractive. If one of them got a promotion, she'd spend days analyzing what made them special. If someone bought a new car or went on an expensive vacation, she'd hint for weeks about how we should upgrade our lifestyle too. But the real revelation came during a dinner with her college friends. One of them had recently gotten engaged to a guy who was apparently some kind of big shot in tech. The whole evening, my wife was practically glowing every time this friend talked about her fiancé. He's so confident, she kept saying, so sure of himself, never second-guesses anything. I sat there listening to her praise all the qualities in another man that she constantly attacked in me. Confidence, decisiveness, leadership, the ability to make choices without asking for permission. She was describing everything she claimed to hate about fragile male egos. But when it came wrapped in someone else's success story, suddenly it became attractive. That's when I realized what was really happening. She didn't hate confident men. She resented being married to one who wasn't performing at the level she thought she deserved. In her mind, I was supposed to be the successful, dominant guy she could show off to her friends. But somewhere along the way, she decided I wasn't living up to her expectations. So instead of communicating that directly, she'd chosen to tear me down piece by piece, hoping to shape me into whatever version of a man would make her look good. The fragile male ego attacks weren't about my behavior at all. They were about her disappointment in her own choices. I tested this theory by paying attention to when she used the phrase most often. Sure enough, it always happened after she'd been exposed to someone else's success story, after talking to her sister about her husband's promotion, after seeing a friend's vacation photos, after watching some couple on social media that she envied. She'd come home from these interactions feeling inadequate, and then she'd take it out on me by making sure I felt inadequate too. It was like she was trying to pull me down to whatever level she thought we were both stuck at. But here's where it got really interesting. I started noticing that she was actually terrible at hiding her own insecurities. The same woman who could spot and attack mine with surgical precision was completely blind to how obvious her own weaknesses were. Like how she'd always steer conversations toward topics where she could show off her knowledge or experience. How she'd interrupt people to correct minor details in their stories. How she'd name-drop constantly even when it wasn't relevant to the conversation. How she'd dress differently depending on who we were seeing, carefully calibrating her appearance to what she thought would impress them. The woman who spent so much time attacking my supposed need for validation was completely desperate for it herself. She just thought she was being subtle about it. I started keeping a mental inventory of these moments. Every time she sought approval, every time she showed insecurity, every time she revealed just how much she needed to feel important and special. And I realized I was sitting on a gold mine of information. Because the truth was I didn't actually have a fragile ego. I had preferences, standards, and the confidence to express them. What she was calling fragility was actually strength, and what she was calling her own strength was actually desperate insecurity. The irony was perfect. She'd been trying to break down my confidence, while being completely unaware of how desperately she needed confidence herself. She'd been attacking my ego while having no idea how transparent her own ego issues were to anyone who bothered to look. And now I was looking, really looking, taking notes, understanding patterns, seeing through the whole performance. She thought she was the one in control, the one calling the shots, the one who could manipulate me with her little phrase. What she didn't realize was that she'd just given me the complete blueprint for how to dismantle her entire psychological defense system. Every insecurity she'd revealed, every desperate need for validation she'd shown, every moment of weakness she'd tried to hide, it was all cataloged in my head. She wanted to play games with confidence and ego. Fine, but she was about to learn that she'd been playing against someone who'd been studying her moves while she thought she was winning. The opportunity to turn the tables came sooner than I expected. We were at her cousin's wedding, surrounded by all her extended family and their friends. It was the perfect stage for her favorite performance, and she didn't disappoint. The reception was in full swing when the conversation at our table turned to career changes. Her aunt was talking about how her son had just left his corporate job to start his own consulting business. Everyone was impressed by his courage and entrepreneurial spirit. I mentioned that I'd actually been considering something similar, maybe freelancing in my field or exploring some business ideas I'd been researching. It was a completely normal contribution to the conversation, but I could see her eyes light up with that familiar predatory gleam. "Oh, here we go," she said with that practiced laugh. "He's been talking about this for months, but you know how men are with their big dreams and fragile egos. Can't handle the idea that maybe they're not cut out to be the next big entrepreneur." The table went quiet for a moment. This was usually where I'd either get defensive or change the subject, giving her exactly what she wanted. But not this time. I set down my drink and looked directly at her with a calm smile. "That's interesting," I said. "Tell me more about fragile egos." She blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "What do you mean?" "Well, you seem to be an expert on the subject. I'm curious about your research." I kept my tone genuinely interested, like I was asking for professional advice. "I don't need research," she laughed. But there was uncertainty in her voice now. "It's pretty obvious." "Is it?" "Because I was just thinking about fragile egos earlier today. Like how someone might need to constantly put others down to feel better about themselves, or how they might be so insecure about their own choices that they have to attack anyone who shows confidence or ambition. The conversation at the table had completely stopped. Everyone was watching this unfold. Or, I continued, still smiling pleasantly, how someone might be so desperate for social approval that they'd humiliate their own spouse just to get a few laughs from relative strangers. That would definitely qualify as a fragile ego, wouldn't it? Her face was starting to change color, but I pressed on with the same calm, academic tone. I mean, think about it logically. If someone is secure and confident, they build up the people around them, especially their partner. But if someone is insecure and fragile, they tear others down to make themselves feel superior. It's textbook psychology, really. She opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. Take this situation, for example. I shared a completely normal thought about career possibilities, and your immediate instinct was to mock it in front of your family. Now, a confident person might have said, "That sounds interesting, tell us more." But a person with a fragile ego? They'd feel threatened by their partner's ambition and try to shut it down publicly. The silence at the table was deafening. Her cousin's wife was staring at her drink. Her aunt was looking between us like she was watching a tennis match, and her uncle had suddenly become very interested in his wedding cake. But the best part was watching my wife's face. The smug confidence was completely gone, replaced by something I'd never seen before, genuine panic. She was realizing, probably for the first time, that her little psychological weapon could be turned around and used against her. "You're being ridiculous," she finally managed, but her voice was shaky. "Am I? Because I think what's ridiculous is spending your marriage trying to make your husband look weak and stupid. That's not the behavior of someone who's secure in themselves or their relationship." I leaned back in my chair, completely relaxed, while she sat there looking like she'd been hit by a truck. "You know what I think?" I continued conversationally. "I think you've been projecting this whole time. Every time you talk about fragile male egos, you're really talking about your own insecurities. You're so worried about not being impressive enough, not having accomplished enough, not being married to someone successful enough, that you've convinced yourself the problem is everyone else's confidence." Her aunt cleared her throat awkwardly. "Maybe we should talk about something else." "Of course," I said pleasantly. "I just found the psychology interesting. It's amazing how people reveal their own issues when they think they're analyzing others." My wife didn't say another word for the rest of the evening. Not one sarcastic comment, not one attempt to undermine me, nothing. She sat there looking smaller and smaller as the night went on. The drive home was completely silent until we were almost at our house. Finally she spoke, and her voice was different, quieter, less certain. "That was really mean." I glanced over at her. "Was it?" "Because I thought I was just having a conversation about psychology and human behavior. You know, the same kind of analysis you've been doing to me for months. That's different how she didn't have an answer for that because there wasn't one. What I'd done was hold up a mirror to her behavior, and she didn't like what she saw reflected back. "You embarrassed me in front of my family. Now you know how it feels," I said simply. We pulled into the driveway, and I could see her processing what had just happened. For the first time in our marriage, she'd been on the receiving end of her own tactics. She'd experienced what it felt like to have someone calmly and systematically dismantle her confidence in front of an audience. And the beautiful thing was I'd done it using nothing but logic and observation. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't gotten emotional, hadn't done anything except point out exactly what she'd been doing to me. As we walked into the house, I could tell something fundamental had shifted. The dynamic had changed. She was no longer the one in control of this psychological game. She was about to learn what it really meant to have a fragile ego exposed. The days following the wedding were fascinating to watch. My wife was like a computer trying to process an error it couldn't understand. She'd start to say something sarcastic, then catch herself. She'd begin to reach for her old tactics, then hesitate. But old habits die hard, and it didn't take long for her to try again. We were at the grocery store when she decided to test the waters. I was comparing prices on different brands of coffee when she made her move. You know, most people just grab coffee and go, but I guess some people need to analyze every decision like it's a life or death situation. Must be exhausting having such a fragile. She didn't even finish the sentence before I turned to look at her with raised eyebrows. "Go ahead," I said calmly. "Finish that thought. I'm curious to hear more about your theory on decision-making and psychological fragility." She actually took a step back. Never mind. No, please continue. "I found your analysis at the wedding so insightful. Something about how people reveal their own insecurities when they attack others. I'd love to hear more of your expertise on the subject." She grabbed the first bag of coffee she saw, and practically threw it in the cart. "Let's just go." That became the new pattern. Every time she tried to deploy her old weapon, I'd calmly invite her to elaborate, to explain her psychology, to share more of her insights about fragile egos and insecurity. And every time she'd retreat. But the real breakthrough came during dinner with another couple a few weeks later. They were telling us about some relationship advice they'd gotten from a counselor, and my wife saw her opening. "Therapy is great," she said with forced casualness, "especially for people who have trouble handling criticism or different perspectives. Some people just can't take feedback without their egos getting bruised." I didn't even look up from my meal. "That's so true," I agreed. "In fact, I was just reading about that. Apparently, people who constantly need to criticize and belittle others are usually projecting their own inability to handle feedback. It's a defense mechanism for people who are deeply insecure about their own choices and accomplishments." Our friends nodded thoughtfully, not realizing they were witnessing psychological warfare disguised as intellectual discussion. "The article mentioned that truly confident people build others up," I continued, "while fragile people tear others down. It said that if you want to identify someone with serious ego issues, just watch how they treat their closest relationships. Do they support and encourage, or do they mock and undermine?" My wife had gone completely still. Our friends were looking between us, starting to sense something was happening, but not quite sure what. "It was really eye-opening," I finished. "Made me think about all the relationships I've observed over the years. You can tell so much about someone's psychological state by how they treat their partner in public." The conversation moved on, but my wife didn't participate. She just sat there, probably realizing that I just used her own tactics against her twice in one exchange, and she hadn't even seen it coming. Later that night, she finally cracked. "You're doing this on purpose," she said as we got ready for bed. "Doing what?" "You know what? This whole thing where you turn everything around." I looked at her in the mirror while I brushed my teeth. "I'm just participating in conversations about psychology and human behavior. I thought you enjoyed those discussions. Stop pretending you don't know what you're doing." I rinsed and turned to face her. "Okay, let's be direct. Then you spent months trying to condition me to accept disrespect by calling it psychology. You tried to make me feel weak and insecure for having standards and preferences. You humiliated me in front of friends and family because you thought you could get away with it." Her face was getting red, but I wasn't finished. "But here's what you didn't count on. I'm actually not fragile or insecure. I'm confident enough to recognize manipulation when I see it, smart enough to understand what you were really doing, and strong enough to turn your own game against you. I wasn't trying to manipulate you." "Really? Then what would you call systematically attacking someone's confidence every time they show backbone or make a decision? What would you call using psychology as a weapon to control someone's behavior?" She didn't have an answer because there wasn't a good one. "The difference between us," I continued, "is that I don't actually need to tear you down to feel good about myself. But apparently, you do. And now that you can't do it anymore, you're lost." I could see her trying to process this new reality. For months she'd been operating under the assumption that she was the psychologically superior one in our relationship. She thought she understood people better, thought she could read and manipulate situations better, thought she was smarter and more aware. But now she was discovering that not only had I seen through her entire strategy, I'd been studying it, learning from it, and preparing to use it against her. She'd been playing checkers while I was playing chess. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now you decide what kind of person you want to be," I said. "Someone who builds up their partner, or someone who tears them down? Someone who's secure enough to respect the person they married, or someone who's so insecure they need to constantly prove their superiority?" I headed toward the bedroom door, then paused. "But here's what's not going to happen anymore. You're not going to disrespect me and call it psychology. You're not going to mock me in public and call it humor. And you're definitely not going to attack my confidence and call it insight." I looked back at her standing there, smaller somehow than she'd seemed in months. "Because if you try it again, I'll do exactly what I did tonight. I'll calmly and methodically expose every insecurity you've revealed, every desperate need for validation you've shown, and every moment of weakness you've tried to hide. And I'll do it with the same smile you used when you thought you were winning." The room was completely quiet for a long moment. "The choice is yours," I said finally. "But choose carefully, because the version of me that tolerated disrespect, he's gone, and he's not coming back." The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was undeniable. Over the next few weeks, I watched my wife grapple with a reality she'd never had to face before, being married to someone who wouldn't tolerate her psychological games. The first test came during a dinner party at our house. She'd invited some of her work colleagues, probably hoping to regain some sense of control on her home turf. Everything was going smoothly until one of her key workers complimented the meal I prepared. I saw the familiar look in her eyes, that predatory gleam that meant she was about to strike. "Oh, he loves playing chef," she started with that tone I knew so well. "Gets very particular about his recipes. You know how men can be when they think they're experts at—" She stopped mid-sentence because I was looking directly at her with the calmest, most interested expression you could imagine. "Please continue," I said pleasantly. "I'm fascinated by your observations about expertise in gender psychology, especially coming from someone who just spent 20 minutes explaining to everyone how to properly arrange appetizers." The table went quiet. Her coworker looked confused, and my wife's face went through about 5 different expressions before settling on something resembling panic. I didn't mean—" "Of course you didn't," I said with a warm smile, "just like you didn't mean anything by all those other fascinating psychological insights you've shared over the months. But please don't let me interrupt your analysis of fragile egos and expertise complexes." She didn't say another word about my cooking, my expertise, or my ego for the rest of the evening. In fact, she barely spoke at all. After everyone left, we cleaned up in silence. Finally, as we finished loading the dishwasher, she spoke. "You've made your point, have I?" "What point is that?" "That you can embarrass me too." I turned to look at her. "Is that what you think this is about?" "Embarrassment, isn't it?" "No, this is about respect. This is about you learning that actions have consequences. This is about you discovering that the person you married isn't going to be your emotional punching bag just because you're frustrated with your own life." She leaned against the counter, looking defeated. "I never meant to be cruel, but you were, consistently, systematically. And you enjoyed it. I thought I was just being funny." "Really? Because humiliating someone in front of their friends and family is hilarious to you?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. "Here's what I think happened," I continued. "You got so comfortable thinking you were smarter and more psychologically aware than me that you forgot I might actually be paying attention. You thought you could condition me to accept disrespect by disguising it as insight." I dried my hands and faced her completely. "But the truth is, I've been watching you this whole time. Learning how you operate, understanding what drives you, seeing through every insecurity you thought you were hiding. And what I discovered is that you're nowhere near as secure or confident as you pretend to be." Her eyes were getting watery, but I wasn't done. "You want to know what a fragile ego actually looks like? It's needing to tear down your partner to feel superior. It's being so threatened by someone else's confidence that you have to attack it constantly. It's being so insecure about your own choices that you have to make everyone else feel small." "Okay," she whispered. "I get it. Do you? Because I don't think you do. I think you're still operating under the assumption that this is some kind of temporary role reversal, that eventually things will go back to how they were." I moved closer, and she actually took a step back. "But they won't, because I've seen who you really are when you think you have power over someone. I've watched you try to systematically destroy my confidence for your own entertainment. And now I know exactly what you're capable of." "What does that mean?" "It means that the version of our marriage where you get to disrespect me whenever you feel like it is over permanently. It means that if you ever try to use psychology as a weapon against me again, I'll dismantle you so completely that you'll wish you'd never heard the phrase, fragile male ego." The kitchen was dead silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. "So what happens now?" she asked. And for the first time in months, there was no attitude in her voice. No smugness, no superiority, no hidden agenda, just genuine uncertainty. "Now you decide if you want to be married to someone you respect or if you want to keep playing games with someone who's better at them than you are." I started walking toward the stairs, then paused. "But understand this, I'm not the same person who used to tolerate your little psychological experiments. That man was patient, understanding, willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. This man has seen exactly who you are when you think you can get away with it." I looked back at her standing there in our kitchen, looking smaller and more uncertain than I'd ever seen her. "You wanted to fragment someone's ego. Congratulations. You succeeded. The only problem is it wasn't mine that broke, it was yours. And now you get to live with knowing that your husband sees right through every insecure, manipulative thing you do." I headed upstairs, leaving her alone with that thought. 3 months later, she still hasn't used that phrase. Not once, because she finally learned what it actually means to respect someone's boundaries. She learned that there are consequences for trying to systematically tear down someone's confidence. And most importantly, she learned that the man she married isn't someone she can manipulate or control. The funny thing is, our relationship is actually better now. Turns out when someone stops trying to make you feel weak and stupid all the time, you can actually enjoy being around them. Who would have thought, but she knows, and I know that this new dynamic isn't negotiable. She crossed the line, got called out for it, and discovered that she'd seriously underestimated who she was dealing with. The woman who thought she could fragment my ego learned what it really means to have yours completely dismantled by someone who was paying attention the whole time. Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story.